If you clicked on this video, you probably feel like you've lost control of your own life, lost control of your emotions and your reactions. If you feel this way, know that you haven't lost control of your life because of procrastination. It wasn't the addiction or the lack of discipline. What brought you to this point was an older, quieter problem, and one that was much harder to see. And the proof of that is in the moment when you needed yourself most, and you simply weren't there. In 1600, a samurai named Miyamoto Musashi fought over 60 duels throughout his life. He never lost one. But the story that books rarely tell is that Musashi often arrived at duels hours late, barefoot, in the wrong clothes, without the expected protocol, not because he was careless. Because he had mastered something his opponents lacked, inner composure. While they waited tensely, consuming mental energy even before the first move, Musashi arrived unwavering. The battle was already won before it began. After Musashi finished his most famous philosophical treatise, the Book of Five Rings, he died. But the words he left behind describe something that modern neuroscience only named at the end of the 20th century: the ability to separate emotional state from action. To not be moved by what happens outside but governed by what exists within. Researchers at Harvard University have discovered that the human mind spends about 47% of waking time in wandering mode, wandering, reacting and processing stimuli automatically without any conscious direction. 47%. Almost half of your life happens without you actually being present. Matteo Santiago knew this. Not because I had read Musashi, not because I knew Harvard. He knew because he was living this statistic in real time in a sales office on the 13th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan with a target he hadn't been able to meet for the third consecutive month. New York isn't a city. It's a continuous pressure test, and Matteo, who had grown up in the green silence of Vermont, was being destroyed by this test, silently, methodically, without understanding why. This video is about what he discovered, about the 90-day protocol that will develop terrifying self-control in you, and about that level of self-control that no one taught you, but that changes everything. This channel exists for people who have already understood that most of the answers the world offers are not enough. If you are one of those people, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel because the next video this channel will publish is about the top 10 Japanese concepts that reprogram your brain. To be notified when this video is published, make sure you're subscribed and that notifications are turned on. Now, back to the video. Chapter 1. The Man Who Couldn't Find Himself. Matteo was not a man without potential. He had graduated with honors. He had moved to New York with the determination that few of his Vermont friends would understand. He had landed the job he wanted at a mid-sized tech company, on a sales team that regularly closed six-figure deals. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence. The problem was that every time the pressure increased, and in sales, the pressure never decreased, Matteo would lose himself. Not literally. He remained seated in his chair, headset in, eyes fixed on the screen. But something internal was shifting. A difficult call, and he would spend the next 40 minutes ruminating on it instead of preparing for the next one. A rejection, and his state would change so completely that the entire afternoon would be lost. A criticism from his manager, and he would spend hours building internal defenses for an argument that would never be said aloud. He thought the problem was procrastination, so he tried productivity techniques, Pomodoro, time blocks, lists. Nothing worked consistently because the problem wasn't time management, it was mental state management. He thought it was an addiction, to his cell phone, to distractions, to constantly seeking approval through performance metrics. So he tried periods of digital detox. It worked for a few days. Then it all came back, because the problem wasn't the cell phone. It was what the cell phone was filling. Matteo was looking at the symptoms and calling them a disease. The real illness had another name: and he would only discover that name when a man named Sora decided it was time for a conversation Matteo hadn't asked for. Sora Ishikawa was not the type of manager who appeared on the covers of business magazines. He didn't shout. He didn't use motivational language. He didn't plaster goals on the wall in colorful letters. He was 42 years old, had worked in Tokyo before going to New York, and had learned something in Japan that most Westerners take decades to understand, if they understand it at all. One Thursday afternoon, without any formal warning, Sora appeared at Matteo's table. "Do you have a few minutes?" It wasn't a real question. They went to the smaller meeting room at the back of the floor. Sora closed the door. He sat down and remained silent for a few seconds before opening her mouth. "Matteo, I've noticed you've been having inconsistent results since you joined the company. As your superior, I'm here to help you, not just to reprimand you. Let me ask you something. When you lose a sale, what happens to you in the next 30 minutes? Matteo considered giving a professional response. However, he told the truth. "I keep ruminating, I get irritated. I keep trying to understand what I did wrong." Sora nodded, not as someone who agreed, as someone who already knew. "And during those 30 minutes, are you available for the next opportunity?" Silence. "No," said Matteo. "That's it," said Sora. "That's the problem." And then he started talking about something Matteo had never heard before. Chapter 2, Jiko Seigyo, the sovereignty that no one gave you. Sora didn't start with philosophy. He started with a question. Do you know the difference between a man who controls his emotions and a man who doesn't need to control them? Matteo didn't know the answer. "The first one is always at war," Sora said. "The second one has found something deeper than war." The concept that Sora was about to present has a 2,000-year history in Japan, but its application goes beyond Japanese culture. It appears under other names in almost every philosophical tradition that has survived the test of time. Jiko Seigyo. The kanji reveal the essence, the self, the ego. Control, dominion, governance. But the literal translation misses something. In the Japanese context, Seigyo is not the forced containment of something that wants to escape. It is the natural sovereignty of one who fully inhabits their own interior. It's the difference between a man who keeps an animal in a cage and a man who never raised the animal. Sora explained this to Matteo using other words. You're trying to control your reactions after they've already happened. That's like trying to stop an avalanche with your bare hands. Jiko Seigyo isn't about stopping the avalanche. It's about not creating the snow. Matteo remained quiet. Like this. Your emotional reactions, the rumination, the irritation, the breakdown after a rejection, are not the problem. They are the result. The problem is that you never learned to inhabit the space that exists between what happens to you and what you do with it. This space has a name. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived 4 concentration camps, wrote about it with a clarity that few have been able to match. He called this space the last of the human rights. The ability to choose one's own response to any stimulus, regardless of external circumstances. Frankl had lost his family. He had lost his manuscripts. He had lost everything the world calls freedom. But he never lost that inner space. And it was from this space that he survived. It's not an abstract concept, it's a location, a place within you that exists before the reaction and that most people never visit. Sora continued. In Japan there is a practice called ma, the space between things. In music it's the silence between the notes. In architecture it's the emptiness that gives meaning to the structure. In a human being it's the pause between stimulus and response. Jiko Seigyo is learning to live in that space. Matteo listened, but he still hadn't fully understood, because Jiko Seigyo was only half of what Sora wanted to show. The other half was older, and in a sense more frightening, Fudoshin. Have you ever seen someone who, regardless of what's happening around them, simply doesn't change? Sora asked. I'm not talking about rigidity. I'm talking about a person who can receive devastating criticism and remain completely present, who can miss a huge opportunity and not fall apart, who can be pressured from the outside and remain solid on the inside. Matteo had seen it. It was Sora himself. Fudoshin, Sora said, isn't about suppressing what you feel. It's about being greater than what you feel. It's about a mind that doesn't move because it has found something more permanent than circumstances. Samurai trained in Fudoshin not to become cold, but to avoid being destroyed by heat. There was a fundamental distinction that the West generally reverses. The warrior with Fudoshin feels everything is done with depth, the pain, the loss, the pressure. He simply isn't defined. That's why. Emotion passes like the weather. It remains like the mountain. The man who possesses Fudoshin is not one who does not feel. He is one who is not governed by what he feels. Teshu Yamaoka, swordsman and Zen master of the 19th century. Sora paused. You've been trying to become a different person, Matteo. But what you need is a different kind of center. Chapter 3. The Crisis That Revealed Everything. 3 weeks after that conversation, Matteo was having the worst time of the quarter. An account he had worked on for 2 months had closed with a competitor, and worse, it wasn't because the price was better. The client had said with disconcerting clarity that he had felt instability in his relationship with Matteo, that at times he seemed confident and at others insecure, and that this had created doubt. The rejection wasn't about the product. It was about Matteo, and Matteo knew that. The office was buzzing with activity that afternoon, simultaneous calls. The entire team was under pressure. Sora walked between the desks with a presence that seemed to alter the physics of the room, calm, direct, unhurried. Matteo sat with his hands on the table, staring at the screen, unable to dial the next number. He wasn't being lazy. It was state paralysis. Inside, he was in a loop, ruminating about the lost account, projecting what the manager would think, anticipating the pipeline meeting on Friday, fearing being one of the lowest performers on the team for the 4th month. All of this happening simultaneously, in silence while the office revolved around him. He picked up his cell phone, opened Instagram, scrolled for 30 seconds without looking at anything, closed it, opened his email, closed it, grabbed an empty glass of water, got up to get water he didn't need at that moment. Escape. 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 Not from a physical predator, from himself. And it was at that exact moment that Sora stopped beside Matteo's table. He said nothing. He just stared at the blank screen, at the open dialer, at the 37 minutes that had passed without a single call being made. Meeting room, Sora said. 3 words, no judgment in her tone. When the door closed, Sora asked a question that Matteo wasn't expecting. Where were you? Here, Matteo said automatically. No, said Sora. Where are you? He was. Silence. I was thinking about the account I lost. And before that? What will the director be thinking about on Friday? And before that? No, about what happened with the last call I made this morning. The guy was rude and I was... He stopped. Sora finished the sentence for him. You stayed there, mentally, for hours. Matteo didn't answer, because it was true. You're not here, Matteo. You're traveling between the past and the future so fast that the present, the only place where you can act, is completely empty. And then Sora said something that would take Matteo weeks to fully digest. The problem isn't that you feel these things. The problem is that you don't have a center to return to. When the storm comes, you become the storm. A man with Fudoshin can be in the middle of a hurricane and remain still, because he has something more solid than the hurricane inside him. Matteo looked at Sora. How do you do that? You train, Sora said. Not in drama. In ordinary things. Chapter 4. The 90 Days That Changed the Internal Structure. Sora didn't give Matteo a 10-step program. He gave him 3 practices, just 3, and he said that if he applied them rigorously for 90 days, something in his inner structure would change permanently, not as a habit but as an identity. The first practice Sora called the testimony. Whenever a strong emotion arose, anger, anxiety, fear, frustration, Matteo had to do one thing before taking any action: name what was happening in the third person. No, I am angry. But there's anger rising now. It seems simple. It is technically simple. But the effect is profound. Researchers at UCLA have discovered that the simple act of naming an emotion in descriptive language, instead of identifying with it, measurably reduces activity in the amygdala. The amygdala is the structure responsible for the fight or flight response. When you become the observer of the emotion instead of being the emotion, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational judgment, regains control. This is not a metaphor. It's neurology. Matteo began to practice. It was uncomfortable. The mind resists observation. The mind wants to be the event, not the observer of the event. But with repetition, something changed. Matteo began to notice a space, small at first, almost imperceptible, between the phone rejection and the internal reaction, between the manager's criticism and the state of collapse. A moment, sometimes just 2 or 3 seconds, where he was present before the reaction. This space was Josei in embryonic form. Sora called the second practice the return to the present. Every time Matteo realized he was mentally in the past or the future, ruminating, anticipating, projecting, he should perform a deliberate physical action, not a meditative breathing exercise, a concrete action, touching the surface of the table with both hands and feeling its temperature and texture for exactly 10 seconds. It sounds primitive, but it serves a specific neurological function. It anchors consciousness in the body, which always exists in the present. The mind travels, the body does not. In the first 15 days, Matteo performed this movement dozens of times a day. Over time, the frequency decreased because the feedback was happening more quickly. The rumination loop was getting shorter. The third practice was the most difficult. Sora called it the delayed response. Whenever a stimulus triggered an impulsive reaction, the urge to respond defensively to an email, to argue with a difficult client, to check his phone when anxiety increased, Matteo should impose a deliberate 90-second delay before acting. 90 seconds. That's all. Neuroscientist Jill Bolte-Taylor, who survived a massive stroke and documented the experience with clinical precision, describes in her work that any emotion has a physiological cycle of approximately 90 seconds within the body. When you don't feed the emotion with additional thought, when you simply observe and wait, it begins to dissipate on its own. It is the subsequent thoughts that keep the emotion alive, not the emotion itself. 90 seconds of inaction break the cycle. Matteo applied this to sales calls. When a client was aggressive, he would take a breath, wait, and then respond, not coldly, with presence. The difference that customers felt was real. He began to notice it in their reactions. There was something different about the quality of attention a person with Fudoshin offered. When you're not managing your own internal reaction in real time, when your state doesn't depend on how the conversation is going, you become completely available to the other person. You listen with a different depth. You perceive what's being said beneath the words. And people feel it. Without knowing how to name it, they feel it. On the 30th day, Matteo closed the biggest contract of the month with the team. By the 60th day, their conversion rate had risen 31%. By the 90th day, he was no longer trying to control his reactions. He had simply become someone whose reactions were different. Chapter 5. What people feel without being able to name it. There is a phenomenon that occurs when a person reaches an advanced level of combined Josei and Fudoshin, and it is rarely described accurately. People around them begin to feel something they can't name. It's not charisma in the conventional sense. that extroverted performative energy that Western culture often confuses with leadership. It's almost the opposite. It's a quality of presence that conveys without words that the person doesn't need anything you can offer as validation, and at the same time is completely available to you as a human being. This combination is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily magnetic. Psychologists call it non-reactive dominance. Non-reactive dominance. It is the absence of any need to prove, defend, or gain approval. And paradoxically, this absence of need creates in others a kind of instinctive, almost primitive attraction. Neuroscience has an explanation for this. The human nervous system is constantly calibrated by the social environment. We read the internal state of others through micro-expressions, voice quality, breathing patterns, posture, in real time and unconsciously. When we encounter someone whose internal state is genuinely stable, our nervous system registers this as a sign of safety. And safety, at an evolutionary level, is the most precious asset a social being can offer. A person with true Fudoshin isn't performing calmness. They are being calm. And the difference between performance and being is immediately detectable, even by people who don't know what they're detecting. Matteo started noticing this in his relationships outside of work as well. Conversations that once ended in conflict began to end in resolution, not because he had learned communication techniques, but because he had stopped bringing his inner instability into conversations. People began to seek him out more often, not for advice, for his presence. There was something Sora had said at the beginning which Matteo only fully understood on the 90th day. The most frightening level of self-control doesn't feel like control at all. It feels natural. And the naturalness of a man who has become master of his own inner self is one of the rarest things that exist. Matteo had thought that phrase was beautiful when Sora said it. Now he knew it was true, because he had lived on both sides. He had been the man who fought against himself in silence, and lost systematically to stimuli that should have been irrelevant. And he had become the man who watched his own storm without becoming the storm. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There wasn't a moment of sudden enlightenment. It was an accumulation of small victories over the ordinary. The response he didn't give impulsively, the state he recovered more quickly, the presence he maintained when everything around him pressed for a reaction. And then on an ordinary day, without any special circumstances, he realized that he was simply there, present, complete, available, without having to manage anything. Here's what nobody tells you about Josei and Fudoshin. These concepts were not created for samurai. They were created for the merchant who needed to negotiate under extreme pressure without losing their judgment, for the craftsman who worked for years on a single object without letting frustration degrade the quality of their work, for the doctor who needed to remain present in the face of a patient's suffering without being destroyed by it. In other words, they were created for people exactly in Matteo's situation. And the reason these concepts have survived 2,000 years is not because they are philosophically elegant, although they are. It's because they work, because they correspond to something real in the structure of human experience that doesn't change with technology, culture, the job market, or the century you were born in. The internal state is the only territory you fully govern. Everything else, the market, the economy, people's opinions, the results you pursue, exists outside your jurisdiction. Only your inner state is yours. And the question this video wants to leave you with is not, how are you going to apply this? The question is, have you ever stopped to realize how much of your life has been governed by states you never chose? 3 things remain. First, the problem was never what you thought it was. Procrastination, addiction, lack of discipline, these are symptoms. The problem is the ungoverned internal state, and attacking the symptom without addressing the root cause is the most exhausting and least efficient work there is. Secondly, Josei and Fudoshin are not techniques. They are internal architectures. They take time to build, and they are built on a micro level, not a heroic one. Every time you create the space between stimulus and response, you are laying a block. Every time you return to the present when the mind wanders, you are building the structure. There are no shortcuts, there is accumulation. Third, the level of self-control that scares people isn't what you display, it's what you become. And when you become it, when the center is established, you no longer need to fight against anything. You simply act from a place most people have never encountered. Matteo didn't change his job, he didn't change the city, he didn't change his circumstances, he changed the only territory that was under his control. And this territory, when governed with precision, changes everything around it. If you've made it this far, you've already shown that you didn't come looking for entertainment. You came looking for something real. Subscribe. Not for me, but because the next time you need to hear something like this, you want to make sure it shows up on your screen. If you want to continue down this path, one of these videos that's appearing now was made specifically for what you're experiencing. Thank you very much for your attention so far. And remember, be present, walk with honor, follow the path. Until the next video.